Welcome everyone, I'm Michael Lofton. We're doing a video here on Sedevacantism and the problems with Sedevacantism. I've labeled this lecture Contra Sedevacantism, of course the Latin term for against. Clearly I am not a Sedevacantist and I don't take the Sedevacantist position, but I do think it should be engaged, hence the lecture. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation as well, so you'll be able to see this on your screen as we go. And I will also add myself here, picture in picture. That way you can see me as well while we're going through the PowerPoint. Now, what is Sedevacantism, right? That's the question. In fact, a lot of people aren't familiar with the term. So let's not take it for granted. Let's define our terms. Sedevacantism is the idea that there have been no popes since John the 23rd. You heard me correctly? No popes since John the 23rd. Of course, he was the first pope in the post-conciliar era, speaking here of the Second Vatican Council. And so he often is dismissed because Sedevacantists tend to dismiss anything in the post-conciliar era. And of course, John the 23rd is the one who called the council. Now, you might find some Sedevacantists who say that the see of Rome is vacant and has been vacant even prior to John the 23rd, but generally it starts with him. And again, the idea is that there is no reigning pope because the claim is the Holy See, the see of the Bishop of Rome, the successor of St. Peter, is vacant, is empty. Now, in a sense, we all affirm sedevacante, right, in a qualified sense. Whenever a pope dies, yeah, the see is vacant, sure. I remember walking into Mass one time. This was before Francis was elected. And, of course, after Pope Benedict resigned, I walked in, and normally where they have a picture of Pope Benedict, there was just a picture of the keys of the See of Peter, the keys given to him in Matthew 16. And it just said, Sedevacante. And I knew what they meant, but it still didn't look right to me. But yes, we affirm the concept of sedevacante. All of us do who are Catholics in a qualified sense. But we would say that there's no prolonged period of sedevacante. So that's the difference between us and the sedevacantists. Now, the next thing we're going to discuss is what is heresy? And why is this important? Well, for sedevacantists, what is heresy is actually something that they have not defined very well. In fact, many sedevacantists operate with faulty definitions and are ill-informed when it comes to these terms. So we're going to define our terms here because it's very, very important to their claim that the popes in the post-conciliar era are heretics and therefore not able to occupy the see of St. Peter. So let's define our terms. Heresy, what is it? It's the obstinate doubt or denial of a dogma. Now, I'll grant you the term heresy, there have been different definitions to it throughout the ages. Sure. Sometimes it just means to choose an opinion in some of the fathers. So it doesn't always have the technical sense in which we understand the term. That being said, we tend to operate with more qualified definitions now. And the qualified definition is the obstinate doubt or denial of a dogma. Very important to note, of a dogma. Because let's say you deny or you affirm something that is generally not held or generally held in the Catholic Church, but is not dogmatic. You're not a heretic technically. You might be in error. You might be wrong, but you're not a heretic. In order to be a heretic, you have to deny something that is dogmatic. What is dogma? Well, it is something that is in the deposit of faith, scripture, tradition, implicitly or explicitly, and has been definitively taught by the Catholic Church. So not only is it in the deposit of faith, but the Catholic Church has defined it. That's a dogma. We can sometimes speak about undefined dogmas, but yeah, that's a whole nother discussion for another day. Here we're just operating with this definition. Okay, so let's get back to the PowerPoint here and look at it together. A material heretic or material heresy. What is it? It's the belief in heresy without knowledge and consent. So the individual who maintains a heretical proposition but is not aware and is not consenting in the sense of they're aware that it's wrong and they affirm it still. In that sense, we're talking about consent. They don't have that. It's lacking. They are a material heretic. Now, I should also note, heresy only applies to somebody post-baptism, so somebody who has never been baptized could not technically be a heretic if they denied a dogma because they haven't been baptized. So an example of a material heretic would be a Protestant. Not that a Protestant couldn't be a formal heretic, but I'm just saying some of them are just material heretics. They maintain heretical propositions, but aren't necessarily aware that they are heretical. Okay, so that's material heresy. Formal heresy is belief in heresy with knowledge and consent. So they do know that it is heretical, and they still consent to it. That's a formal heretic. Occult heresy. This is not, something related to witchcraft, as you may think. Occult just simply means hidden, secret. So somebody who maintains heretical propositions in secret, they could be formal or material, but it's private. It's not publicly known, as opposed to public heresy, something that is publicly known, whether formal or material, but it's being publicly expressed. That's public heresy. And then lastly, there is what's called manifest or notorious heresy. You might see those different terms somewhat used as synonyms. At least I'm going to use them as synonyms. What is a manifest or a notorious heretic? Well, this is somebody who is obstinate in heresy and pertinacious. There's an element of pertinacity here in their public expression of a heresy. So they know it's heretical. They're publicly making that proposition known. And they remain obstinate despite reproof, despite rebuke, despite knowing better and being corrected. That is a manifest heretic, a notorious heretic. These are extremely important distinctions because they're going to come up in the next slide. And they come up often in these issues with Sedevacantists. They will often read some texts in not church fathers, but theologians in the Middle Ages and later in the Counter-Reformation. They'll read them and they'll gloss over some of these distinctions and nuances and just see that someone's talking about a heretic, but they might not realize they're talking about a manifest heretic. Case in point, Bellarmine, which we're going to see here in a moment. But Bellarmine defines a manifest heretic as someone who has been rebuked twice per the concept that we find in Titus 3:10, where one is to rebuke a heretic twice, then have nothing to do with him. Once that has been done, according to Bellarmine, they are a manifest heretic. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide here. Let's talk about loss of office. Tie some of these concepts together. All right. Well, there's different views on the Pope losing the papal office in relation to heresy. One is by Albert Pigius. Now, these are 5 views described by Robert Bellarmine in his book on the Roman Pontiff. It's translated by Ryan Grant, so you can read it in English. Say a prayer for Ryan Grant that he was so gracious to translate that for us. So, very important work. And here Bellarmine talks about the 5 different opinions on how a pope may lose office in relation to heresy. Again, Albert Pigius has the first opinion. He believes that this is when a pope, well, I should say, he believes that a pope cannot be a heretic and therefore he cannot be deposed. He maintains that view, and in fact, Bellarmine's open to it. He doesn't adopt that view, but he does say it's a legitimate view and likely. I don't agree. I'll just be candid with you. I don't agree at all. I don't think it's the likely view. I understand why someone might take that position, but I think if Bellarmine were living today, he might have some different opinions on what would be likely when it comes to defectibility in the papal office, having seen some of the things that we've seen in the post-conciliar church, to be frank. So I think the goalposts may have moved since Bellarmine's time. All right, well, the second opinion, and he doesn't name a particular person who maintains it. He just says the second opinion is one who believes that the Pope, when he is guilty of occult heresy, so secret or private heresy, that he's immediately deposed by God. And he dismisses that view. And that view, frankly, is insane. Because that would mean that a pope could be deposed and you would have absolutely no idea, because you don't know that he maintains an occult heresy. It's just, there's no way God in his providence could allow something so impractical as that. So that opinion is dismissed. The third opinion is by Torquemada, who maintains that a pope can't be deposed for either occult or manifest heresy, which is also absurd, because it would mean that the church has absolutely no self-defense against someone who is attacking the church, especially one in the highest office of the church. It just seems contrary to reason and God's providence. Okay, the fourth opinion is by Cajetan. This is the view that popes guilty of manifest heresy, right? So they've been rebuked twice, and they're obstinate. They're not immediately deposed by God, but they can be deposed by an ecclesiastical judgment, by the church, judging the case and deposing the pope. Now, Bellarmine rejects this view, not because he believes that the pope couldn't lose office or be deposed or can't be a manifest heretic. He has the opinion, the fifth opinion, that popes guilty of manifest heresy are automatically deposed. But notice he says manifest heresy. This is important. Most Sedevacantists don't catch this because they often appeal to Bellarmine as if he's on their side, and in fact he's not. Bellarmine believes that a manifestly heretical pope automatically loses the papal office. But guess what? A manifestly heretical pope is one who has been rebuked twice by the lawful authorities. In this case, it would be a fraternal correction by the cardinals or an imperfect ecumenical council or just the bishops throughout the world, dispersed throughout the world, collectively rebuking him. He rejects Cajetan's view and opts for that fifth view. But he still believes an ecclesiastical judgment has to be made in determining that he's a manifest heretic. It's just that they don't necessarily have to go and announce it and depose him. He's automatically deposed. I think that that's less likely. I think Cajetan's view is much more likely. It's the view of Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, and others. It makes much more sense that the Pope, who is a manifest heretic, would not be immediately deposed, or at least we would say, okay, if he is immediately deposed, the church would have to make an ecclesiastical judgment for us to know it, at the very least. Maybe we can kind of combine those two views, but I think that last part is key. At the very least, an ecclesiastical judgment would have to make it known to us. So, but neither the fourth view nor the fifth view, that of Cajetan and Bellarmine, neither have occurred with any of the post-conciliar popes, because none of them have been notorious or manifest heretics, because none of them have been rebuked twice and remain obstinate in a denial of a dogma. So, problems for the Sedevacantists here. The next slide here on the PowerPoint, deposing a pope, continuing on this topic. Is the concept of deposing a pope the heresy of conciliarism? Well, first of all, what is conciliarism? Well, this is the idea that a council of bishops is higher in authority than a pope. Okay, well, that's condemned by the church. So we know conciliarism is wrong. Is the claim that a group of bishops, when they recognize that the Pope is a manifest heretic, when they declare he is deposed, is that the error of conciliarism? No. No, because the claim is that God deposes the Pope, because God does have authority over the Pope. The bishops don't, but God does. God deposes the Pope when it is clear he is a manifest heretic. However, the church merely declares it so that the faithful know. And that declaration is not one of authority, but is just making manifest and known what has taken place in the divine council in God's court. So, it's not the concept of conciliarism, I would argue. Now, there is a quote here by Cardinal Journet that I found very helpful. I got this from John Salza and Robert Sisko's book, True or False Pope, which I think is excellent. I think it's very, very helpful. I think it's one of the best guides against Sedevacantism. I think you need to get a copy if you're engaging Sedevacantists and read it. It's a very long book, but read it. Well worth your time and well worth your money. Here's what it says. The church's action is simply declaratory. Then the authoritative action of God disjoins the papacy from a subject who, persisting in heresy, after admonition, becomes in divine law inapt to retain it any longer. In virtue, therefore, of Scripture, the church designates and God deposes. God acts what the church says, John of St. Thomas. So what he's saying is, when he's talking about in virtue of Scripture, he's talking about Titus 3:10, right? Rebuke a heretic twice and then have nothing to do with them. It's God who disjoins the Pope from the church. It's God who judges him. It's merely the church that declares it, that designates him deposed by God, as Cardinal Journet puts it. All right. Now, what is the process for deposing a pope? Is there a process? Well, in fact, there is. John of St. Thomas talks about this. I've kind of summarized it here. If you want to read it in more detail, get Salza and Sisko's book. Number one, well, the Pope publicly expresses a heretical proposition, right? I mean, that's point number one. He has to express something that's heretical publicly. Otherwise, we can't know about it. It's a cult. Number two, he has to be rebuked twice, fraternally, by the cardinals or the bishops. He has to remain obstinate in his heresy. Then the Pope, we could say, is immediately deposed by God. I would argue at that point, sure, it does seem a little bit more likely he would be at that point when it becomes obvious he's a manifest heretic. He's immediately deposed by God, but the key here is that the church declares the deposition of the Pope. We have to know this. We have to know this has happened in God's court, if you will, in God's judgment. Let's talk a little bit about union with Christ, because a lot of Sedevacantists have problems with defining church membership and what it means to be in or out of the church. They often misunderstand some passages or propositions, I should say, by popes in various encyclicals. And I think the distinction between visible and invisible bonds of unity are very helpful in identifying the different ways in which someone can be in the church. Because, of course, somebody is going to say, well, a heretic isn't in the church. And if a pope is a heretic, forget all this deposing the pope. He's automatically out, and we don't have to have a church council declare it, or the cardinals declare it, or whomever declare it, because they're automatically outside of the church. Well, let's explain what it means to be in or out of the church. There's different ways in which somebody could be in and out of the church. It's possible that somebody could be out of the church in one sense and still in the church in another. And that's an important distinction, as I'll explain here in a moment why. There's the visible bonds of unity, which are faith, worship, and governance. That last one refers to jurisdiction of bishops, especially a pope. And then there's the invisible bonds, faith, hope, and charity. Now, it is possible for someone to commit a mortal sin. Let's say formal heresy. And it is possible at this point they've severed the invisible bonds, right? Faith, hope, and charity. Although there's a sense in which we could still talk about, not in the case of a formal heretic, but other mortal sins, we could still talk about faith. But in the case of somebody committing, a formally heretical act, they would lose faith, hope, and charity. That doesn't necessarily mean they lose the visible bonds. Where in here, where we talk about faith, we're talking about just the faith of the church, not necessarily the theological virtue of faith. But notice that other one there, governance. You don't automatically lose jurisdiction as a bishop or a pope, even if you're in mortal sin and you've lost the invisible bonds of unity. There's a sense in which you're outside of the church when you lose those invisible bonds. There's another sense in which you're still in the church, the sense in which you still maintain governance and jurisdiction. So just because somebody is outside of the church in mortal sin doesn't necessarily mean they're outside of the church externally or visibly or in jurisdiction. Again, very important, because a pope could be a formal heretic and still be the pope. Until he is a manifest heretic and has been deposed by God, he remains a pope. All right. Next one, interpreting magisterial documents. Why is this important? Well, often you're going to encounter Sedevacantists who tell you this or that proposition is heretical, or this or that pope teaches that this is dogma, or this or that pope teaches this or that. You're going to encounter that, but oftentimes it's clear that the person that you're talking to doesn't know very much, if anything, about the magisterium and identifying, weighing, judging magisterial propositions. They're often very woefully ignorant in this area, and they have no business in saying a pope said this was dogma or this is heresy when they don't know about it. Now, I'm not going to this is something that would require full course, but I'm just going to throw in a couple concepts here. briefly, not going to be able to cover a whole lot, but I do want to just make a couple points here because I think it's helpful whenever we have these discussions about Sedevacantism or whenever we are engaging a Sedevacantist. There's the papal magisterium, there's the conciliar magisterium, there's the ordinary and universal magisterium, there's different organs, if you will, of the magisterium, and then they can teach in different ways, and this is important to note. Not everything a pope says is infallible, right? Some things that a pope teaches are extraordinary, which would be infallible. Some things that he teaches are ordinary and are not necessarily irreformable and definitive. Could be, but they aren't necessarily so. Same thing for the conciliar magisterium. When ecumenical councils teach, they can do so in an extraordinary way or an ordinary way. Not everything an ecumenical council says is infallible. Not everything it says is definitive. Sometimes it is. When it uses a canon and an anathema, those are generally, especially when it's on a matter of faith and morals, those are generally considered extraordinary acts of the conciliar magisterium and are definitive. But some things taught by ecumenical councils are ordinary, like most of the propositions offered in Vatican II. They are authoritative. One is to give religious assent of intellect and will to them, but they're not necessarily irreformable. Also important to note, because some, Sedevacantists will point you to this or that council. This council said this council said that, and it's not necessarily a proposition that was definitively settled. But they might say, well, this is dogma, or if you deny this, you're a heretic, and that's not exactly the case. You have to be able to interpret magisterial propositions to really be able to make that determination well. The ordinary and universal magisterium, this is when the bishops are spread throughout the world, but they are in union with the Pope, and throughout the ages they have a constant teaching to be held definitively. If a particular magisterial proposition meets those qualifications, then it's part of the ordinary and universal magisterium, and it's therefore definitive. It's irreformable. There's no walking back those propositions, right? They're a little harder to identify, but there are some indicators there. And in fact, this is what I'm writing my doctoral dissertation on, is the indicators, identifying indicators of magisterial propositions, weighing and interpreting them from Pius IX until the present. It's effectively what the dissertation is about. So much, much more about that to come. And then there are non-definitive teachings of the ordinary and universal magisterium, whenever it's not the constant teaching of the bishops, or it might be the constant teaching of the bishops, but it's not something that they taught was to be held definitively. That's key. And if any of those are lacking, even though it's part of the ordinary and universal, it's still ordinary magisterium and potentially reformable. This is also important, because they might say, well, the bishops always taught this. Okay, but was it really always taught? Was it really the constant teaching? And then did they teach it to be held definitively? If not, according to the preconciliar popes, it's not ordinary and universal magisterium. Very, very important. Now, the next thing here is about novel ecclesiology, right? The irony here is that Sedevacantists will accuse us of being innovators and engaging in novelty, but in fact, that's what they do. Pretty much everything they accuse us of, they do themselves. They themselves are guilty of. A lesson in life that we should all learn. I generally have observed that people, whenever they accuse me of something, it's generally, and it's always something that is out of left field, and you wonder, what in the world are they talking about? It's generally something they're engaging in. Just FYI, tip on life for you there. Moving on. Okay, talking about novel ecclesiology of these Sedevacantists. Well, let me pull up the screen here, show you the quote. Vatican I, in Pastor Aeternus, tells us this, and this is definitive, right? This is an extraordinary act of an ecumenical council. Therefore, if anyone says that it is not by the institution of Christ, the Lord himself, that is to say, by divine law, that blessed Peter should have perpetual successors in the primacy over the whole church, or that the Roman pontiff is not the successor of blessed Peter in this primacy, let him be anathema. So there's an anathema here on anyone who denies either one of these propositions. All right, so it's clear there will be perpetual successors. Now, this is a problem for Sedevacantists because they clearly maintain a position that there hasn't been a successor of the Apostle Peter since the 60s. So, in about 60 years. It's a major, major difficulty. Now, they'll say, well, but you also believe that the see can be vacant for a period in time, so we're not denying that there are perpetual successors. We're just saying there could be a long period of time between successors. That's absurd, because it's contrary to the meaning of perpetual. But more importantly, Monsignor Van Noort notes, it is this Roman see, and by the way, Van Noort was, manualist in the preconciliar era. If this Roman see could fall and no longer be the see of truth, but of error and pestilence, then the Catholic Church. Oh, I'm sorry, I have the wrong quote pulled up here. This is actually one by Gasser, which is very important for what we're discussing, but it's actually a different quote by a different individual here. I meant to, I guess I copied and pasted the wrong thing. I meant to put something here by Van Noort. But what effectively Noort says is that there will never be a time in which there is lacking a successor of St. Peter in the papal office. There will never be such a time. And he says it's a fact. So that's effectively what the quote says. And again, this is by manualists in the preconciliar era. So you can't just say, well, he's part of the post-conciliar church. He's part of the problem. All right, then there's the concept of universal and peaceful acceptance. This is something that, I find John Salza and Robert Sisko engage very helpfully in True or False Pope. This is the idea that, even if there is some kind of canonical defect with the election of a pope and he's technically not validly elected by the cardinals, there was some kind of defect there. Even if there was something like that, if the Church Universal peacefully accepts that this or that pope is actually the pope, whatever canonical penalties there were, whatever defects there were, they're healed in the root, to use the language of Cardinal Bio. They're healed in the root, and he becomes immediately the pope. Cardinal Bio says, for the aforementioned adhesion of the church heals in the root all fault in the election and proves infallibly the existence of all required conditions. So even if somehow it were the case that there was some kind of impediment or defect with one of these post-conciliar popes in their election, the fact that all of the post-conciliar popes have been accepted by the church universal peacefully, that shows that they are the pope. So I don't see a way around that. All right, next slide here. Sacraments. Well, for the Sedevacantists, sadly, they are rarely available because there are only a handful, very few, you could probably count them on one hand, bishops in the world that are validly ordained, and very few priests throughout the world. Which means the sacraments are, for the most part, unavailable to the vast majority of mankind, according to the Sedevacantists. This seems contrary to providence, is extremely unreasonable, and is a very, very sad state for the person who actually believes that. Now, that's not to say there haven't been times where, in particular places and particular locations and particular moments in time, there hasn't been a deficiency in the sacraments. I mean, I remember Bishop Schneider, whenever he was on the show, he would talk about how There's a period in time where they grew up without the sacraments. So it happens, but that's local and it's for a specific period of time. God may allow that. It would be absolutely absurd that he would allow that for so long, for over 60 years, for the church universal. It's absurd. It's contrary to divine providence. And, more importantly, the next slide is, how would we even move forward if that were true, right? How do we move forward? If we somehow were to accept all of the things, or all the things that the Sedevacantists tell us, and somehow get past all of the objections that I just mentioned, and there are more, I'm just giving you a crash course here. If we were to somehow get past all of those, how do we move forward? How do we get out of this? How do we reverse this? There really aren't any solutions here. Not any solutions that do not seem to be even less likely than the current state of the church. So what I'm saying is, the solution that Sedevacantists are offering us to the current crisis in the church causes more problems than it really solves. It raises more questions than it really answers. So it just seems contrary to reason, providence, the teachings of the church, the teachings of theologians, and so on and so forth. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture on Sedevacantism. If you want to see more, just let me know, and I'll do some more lectures on it. Or if you're interested in another topic, just shoot me a message. Let me know what all you're interested in, and I'll see if I can get to it. But we will be doing more lectures here soon, so everybody stay tuned and look forward to more. Until next time, God bless.